everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to this month's presentation of Stories Lives Tell. You know, if you want reassurance about your decision to live here at the V, just keep attending these Stories Lives Tell presentations. There you go, I hear you, sorry. Because you'll be so impressed with the extraordinary intelligence, wit, talent, charm, and accomplishment of your fellow residents. Absolutely. Thank you for all that. Yay! But I have to tell you, in the almost 2 years that I've been organizing these talks for the Activities Committee, no one, and I mean no one, has been more elusive, more difficult to snag than today's speaker, Dick Atkinson. He said no so many times that I wanted to ask, please teach me how you do that. It's a great skill. In the end, Dick didn't say yes to me or to the Activities Committee, but to his friend, Quelda Wilson, the person you have to thank for today's presentation. And thank goodness for Quelda's success. For again, you're going to be very impressed and delighted with today's speaker. Dr. Richard Atkinson is President Emeritus of the University of California and Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Science and Psychology at UCSD. He served as President of the entire University of California system from 1995 to 2003. His tenure was marked by innovative approaches to admissions, including challenges to the country's most widely used admissions exam, the SAT. Challenges that paved the way to major changes in the way millions of America's youth are now tested for college admission. Dick served for 15 years as Chancellor of UCSD, where he led that campus's emergence as one of the leading research universities in the nation. He is a former director of the National Science Foundation and past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He is the recipient of too many honorary degrees to mention, but here's one I bet you've never heard of. A mountain in Antarctica has been named for him. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to our friend and neighbor, the extremely elusive and extremely accomplished Dr. Richard C. Atkinson.
I will comment on Quelda. One day, my computer broke down. There was no one around to help me. I called her on the phone, and she said, I'll be right up. She was up, and we got the computer running, and then she said, you really should do this talk.
I always wondered how she knows you to do
The title is Memoirs. I did look up the dictionary definition of autobiography and memoir, and the only distinction really is that a memoir really is very personal. It focuses on the personal, almost emotional feelings of individuals. The autobiography is a more thoughtful sequence of one's life's experiences. So this is a memoir. You may find it rather egocentric. I hope you don't walk away thinking that I'm an egomaniac. But as the
half of what?
We say questions.
Half of what?
Half of a lifetime. I'm going to focus just on 1944 to 1980. Is this audio good?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect.
On 1944 to 1980, from age 14 to age 50. I'm not going to be talking about the University of California, nothing after 1980. So your introduction is about all you're going to hear about the University of California. But the story starts, but I should tell you, now we'll see how this works. I should tell you that if you are interested in my background at the University of California, there's a wonderful book called Entrepreneurial President. It's by a historian at Berkeley about my presidency, and there is a chapter in there about events leading up to it. You could buy the book, of course, but it's on the internet. I actually have it on my website, the entire book, so you can go there and peruse through it at your leisure. And then there's also on the website a book that's a collection of speeches and op-eds and the like. I also have a website, and I'll refer to that later because a number of things I'm going to pass over very quickly here today. And if you find them interesting, you'll be able to go back to the website. So my story starts in 1944, the winter of 1944. I'm 14 years old. I'm a sophomore at high school, Oak Park High School, a suburb of Chicago. I had plans to play basketball that Saturday with a friend of mine, a senior in high school. I got to his house to pick him up early in the morning. His mother came to the front door and said, "George can't play with you today. He's got to go out to the University of Chicago to take entrance exams." I was terribly unhappy to hear that. As I was walking out of the driveway, he called from the second-story window and said, "Dick, we're going to drive out there. I'll take the exam. We'll drive back. We'll be back here in a few hours. We'll have the rest of the day. Why don't you come along?" So I decided I might as well join him, and so he, his mother, and the three of us headed out to the University of Chicago. We went to the building. He checked in at the desk for examinations, gave him his name, and they gave him a test booklet, and he had an assigned seat in the testing room. And then the proctor turned to me and said, "What's your name?" And I said, "I'm not on your list. I'm not here to take the test." But the proctor said, "You're here. You might as well take the test." So I did, and about 2 weeks later, he got a rejection letter, and I got admitted with a scholarship. So what to do? I decided I'd go off to the University of Chicago that summer, and if things went well, I'd stay at Chicago, but if they didn't go well, I'd go back to my junior year in high school. So the day I moved into the residence halls at the University of Chicago was the day that the Allies landed in Europe, a pretty exciting time. A couple of weeks later, the Democratic Convention was in Chicago. One of my roommates was the nephew of the governor of Indiana, and he had passes to the convention, and so that was the convention where Roosevelt runs for his fourth term. The theme of the convention was "Don't change horses in the middle of the stream," but they did change horses. They dropped Truman and added, gotta stand up, they dropped Wallace and added Truman. It was a great experience at the University of Chicago. I've written about it. You'll see that on my website. Small classes. Hutchins was the president. It was the peak of the humanities and the 100 great books at the University of Chicago, but it was also a great university for science at the time, still is. And just a few weeks before I got there, the first chain reaction that led to an atomic bomb occurred. So my years at Chicago were interesting years, and along the way I became interested in a professor who was involved, a professor who was involved in building mathematical models to describe certain biological processes. And these were models that looked a lot like Newtonian physics equations, but they were models of cell division, models of neural networks, how they could, artificial neural networks, and how they could be organized to generate phenomena that would approximate what the human mind might approximate. So it was very interesting work, and I did computations for him on a certain set of disorderly equations. Played a big role in chaos theory later. And when I finished my undergraduate degree at Chicago, I entered the PhD program at Chicago in what was called the Committee on Biology, the Committee on Mathematical Biology. But early that fall, in my graduate program, I attended a lecture by a man named Bill Estes. He was a young faculty member at Indiana University, and I just was struck by the beautiful work that he was doing, developing mathematical models for learning and memory processes, central topic in the study of psychological phenomena. And after the talk, we talked at some length. I enjoyed it immensely and ended up visiting him at Indiana University, and the next thing I knew, I found myself as a graduate student at Indiana University, enrolled in the PhD program in both psychology and in mathematics. I'm not going to go into his theoretical work. He was a young guy at the time. He becomes very famous later and retires as an endowed chairholder at Harvard University. But at the time, he was in the early stages of developing what came to be called stimulus sampling theory. I'm not going to any of the theory, but it was very remarkable development for the time, and it was based on probabilistic approaches to theory. Probabilistic approaches to theory, and we worked very closely together in my graduate years. Sorry, thanks. In my graduate years, something else happened at Indiana University. Rita, my wife, arrived a year later. She was a student in the clinical psychology program. We were married a year later, and this summer we celebrated 67 years of our life. But when I entered the program, the United States was at war. In Korea, the draft was on. My draft board was anxious to draft me, but the law stated that I could finish my degree program before they could draft me. But in June of 1954, they'd allowed me exactly 4 years. I was drafted into the Army. Now, I might have avoided that, but that's another story. But I entered the Army. I did 8 weeks of basic training, and then I was assigned to a
the right button. It's a right.
I was assigned to a unit
There you go.
at Fort Ord, California. Rita and I drove across country, never had been to California, were stunned by the beauty of the state. What was Humro? It was a civilian research group assigned to this particular Army base, and they were studying human factors as they affected the effectiveness of the Army. They had just completed collecting data on a major study. It was of fighters in Korea. They had about 600 fighters, and they'd evaluated their effectiveness as fighters and enlisted men. And when they came back to the United States, they were held for a special week of testing, and they were given just about any test you can imagine, but a number of psychological tests, IQ tests, some 40 tests. And so when I arrived, there were this huge pot of data, lots of correlations, but no one quite knew what to do with the data. In my graduate program, I spent a lot of time studying probability and statistics, and it was a perfect problem that they had from my perspective. I knew what to do, and I described what had to be done, but then I pointed out that if you were going to do it for 3 or 4 or 5 variables, you could do it on a desk calculator. But if you wanted to do it for more than that, you had to have access to a computer. This is 1954. There are no computers in universities. Very few computers in the world, really. I had never seen a computer. I'd read about them, but never seen one. One of the people there said, well, we think there's a computer over at the Naval Postgraduate School. So I went over to the Naval Postgraduate School, and the fellow who ran the computer center there, we got on very well, and we had a lot of common interests. And he said, of course you can work over here whenever you want. We'd be happy to have you. There was no such thing as computer science in those days, and everybody was just sort of learning the ropes of how to operate computers. And they had a wonderful machine, what was called a 102A machine. I'm wasting too much time here, but it was a National Cash Register machine, and I was working at the Naval Postgraduate School 4 days a week, 1 day at Fort Ord, so it was a rather interesting time. The 4 days at the Naval Postgraduate School, after a week of running around the installation in a private's uniform, where everybody else were officers. It was a school for young officers for technical training, and the only enlisted personnel were people in the kitchen and in the yard work, and here was this private running around. And my 2-star admiral called me in, who was the superintendent. He said, Atkinson, we're happy to have you here, but we don't want you in your uniform. It was a good time. It worked out rather well because Rita had to do a year of clinical internship for her PhD degree and a thesis, and she worked out an arrangement where she could go up to the Stanford VA and work up there doing her work. And so for the two of us, it was a perfect situation. And when I left the Army, she had completed her internship and had completed her thesis and received her PhD degree. But we were crunching numbers on this machine, but the head of the facility, the head of the computer center, was a very innovative guy, and he built games into the computer, and these young officers were playing war games on the computer. And today that doesn't sound very novel, but it was stunningly novel in 1954. And at the same time, there was the development of the theory of games. I don't know how many of you heard of that, but important developments had big implications for theory of economic theory. And the theory of games is a mathematical analysis of hypothetical games, and where each player has certain options, and there's a certain payoff matrix, and the theory of games tells you how you should play this game in order to optimize performance. So he and I got thinking about these problems, and I got very interested in game theory. And but at the same time, I was going up to Stanford often while Rita was up there, and there was a professor of philosophy, really a mathematical logician, interested in the philosophy, the role of theory in science, and I spent time with him. He knew Bill Estes quite well and was quite familiar with the work in stimulus sampling theory. And we hit it off, and suddenly we were talking about game theory, which he was very interested in. And we realized that we could take stimulus sampling theory and apply it to some of these games and determine determine whether two subjects playing the game, two humans playing the game, would actually approach the optimal solution for playing the game according to game theory. So that was a very exciting idea, and Soupy said, look, when you get out of the Army, come to Stanford for a year, and we'll carry out some experiments, testing game theory against learning theory, and see just how things work out. And so that's what I did. We left the Army, went up to Stanford, and we carried out a series of studies. They got quite a bit of attention. The economists were very interested because it had real implications for whether economic theory based on the rational man concept was meaningful. And so everything moved quite well that year at Stanford. And during the course of the year, I became a close friend of Ken Arrow, who was a professor of mathematical economist, but a professor of economics, later received the Nobel Prize. And I became a good friend of Fred Terman, and there's a reason for that I won't be able to fully discuss. But Fred Terman was the provost at Stanford at the time. A few years ago, there was a book published, Fred Terman at Stanford, Building a Discipline, a University in Silicon Valley. He really did transform Stanford. He really did lay the groundwork for Silicon Valley. He was a distinguished electrical engineer, was on the faculty at Stanford after his PhD at MIT. During the war years, he headed the radar program, had 1,000 people, scientists and engineers working on radar at MIT. Great success, obviously, comes back to Stanford as the dean and then becomes the provost. There was a reason why we became so friendly. He was very interested in psychology. His father had been a psychologist, chairman of the psychology department at Stanford in the very beginning history of Stanford. So he had an interest in the psychology, but also a very strong interest in mathematical theories. So it was a great year, but the job market was miserable. I had an offer for a job at UCLA, and the next year I left Stanford and headed off to UCLA. I'm going to have to skip much of this, but the 2 years at UCLA were fabulous years. I enjoyed them immensely. The one thing that relates to later remarks is that I was the junior member in the Department of Psychology, and the junior member, the senior faculty would have nothing to do with teaching introductory psychology. That had to be taught by the junior member in the department. I taught the course for 2 years. I had 2 sections per semester, 250 kids roughly in each section. I did that for 2 years. So over the course of that time, I taught some 8 sections of introductory psychology with 250 kids. There were roughly 2,000 kids in 2 years. That sat through 3 lectures a week with me. It became quite a famous course. I got quite a bit of notoriety. I didn't know a lot about many areas of psychology. My wife helped me through many of the preparations for lectures, but I won a teaching award at UCLA, and it relates to later life. After the time at UCLA, The second year there, I was invited to come back as a visiting scholar at Stanford University. And Supies and I were trying to complete a book at the time on game theory, learning theory, and we were making slow progress, and the idea of being up at Stanford would make it possible to finish it that year. I've been there back at Stanford about 2 months. I get a call from the Fred Terman's office, and basically an invitation to have lunch with Fred Terman, and I was quite pleased, headed over for the luncheon, and when I got there, Ken Arrow and Pat Supies were there, and after lunch, Fred said that he had decided, or the university had decided, to establish a new institute at Stanford, the Institute for Mathematical Studies and the Social Sciences. The co-directors were going to be Supies and Ken Arrow, and they had 4 appointments to make, new appointments. And they offered me a tenure position at Stanford at that point. What was interesting about it is my principal appointment was at the Institute of Mathematical Studies and the Social Sciences, but you had to have a departmental affiliation, and what they worked out was an affiliation with 4 departments. The psychology department, the School of Engineering, the Department of what today would be called Operations Research, Department of Statistics, and then the School of Education. So I took that job. I took that job, and there was a special building set aside for the Institute, funds to build an addition to the Institute for laboratory space to carry out psychological experiments, and and it had a direct connection, phone line connection to, a data connection to the computer center. So it was just an ideal situation. And we arrived at Stanford. Things went quite well. I got my research up and running. And about 2 years into my time at Stanford, Supies and I realized that for some of the types of experiments that we wanted to run, we really had to have a dedicated computer, a computer that was dedicated just to those. We couldn't rely on sharing a master computer with the university. And so Pat Supies, Stanford, applied to the Carnegie Foundation, and the program officer who handled that grant is sitting here in the room, Lloyd Morissette. Lloyd has done some remarkable things in his career, and I'm particularly pleased that he passed favorably on this grant. It was a grant for roughly $1 million, and that was a lot of money in those days. And we went out and bought a PDP-1 computer, first transistorized computer that DEC built. It was a stunning piece of equipment. But in the grant too, haven't I hit 15 minutes yet?
Oh.
You forgot?
I needed to interrupt
Oh
you.
God,
Actually,
I'm in
30.
trouble.
30 minutes. 30 minutes.
Okay.
I did ask for 15, but I can't read it.
But in the Carnegie grant, we said we wanted to use this equipment to run some experiments with young children, first and second graders, and see how you could use computer-assisted instruction with young kids. And then we sort of invented that term. So we began busing some kids into the laboratory at Stanford, and Supies developed some programs for mathematics. I developed some programs for reading, and we had these kids coming into the Stanford campus and it really went beautifully well, and so well that about a year or so later, we were approached by IBM, or we may have approached IBM, I'm not sure, but we came to the decision to jointly build a system. We would design the system, design the programming language for the system, but IBM would build the system, and that's exactly what happened. And here is one of the terminals that was on the system. In 1966, we moved the system onto a school site in Brentwood, California, an area that was about 85% African American at the time. And one trailer held the computer, 650 computer, had to be air conditioned, of course, and then the other terminal held 16 booths where students could march in and take their instruction. This is what this setup looked like. There were no beautiful displays in those days like you have on an iPad or whatever today. There was a CRT on the right. You could write on it. You could print messages. There was a light pen. The student could touch the surface or actually draw figures on the surface. On the left was a slide projector. We wanted some sharp visual materials for the students. A random access slide projector, 1,000 slides in each of those. There was a random access audio system. By random access, don't worry about what I mean by it, but we could individualize messages to the students. So it was off and running, and the whole idea was not to march people through the curriculum in step order, but to really build a program where the individual history of each child determined what happened next in the sequence of instruction. So that became the hallmark of what we were doing, individualizing the instructional process and using learning theory as it was evolving in psychology to help define the optimum theory for how to carry out some instruction. Well, it was a national bonanza. A year later, not a few months after it got underway, Life magazine ran a story on it. It got a lot of attention. The next slide is my assistant actually found the original Life magazine story. And here's part of the story. Hello, Johnny, said the machine. I've been waiting for you. Here's another picture from that life story. It's the interior of the trailer where the student terminals are, students working away. So we did that for about 2 years with the IBM system. We had some very carefully controlled experiments trying to evaluate how effective it was in teaching reading and math. I'm spending too much time, but some students took both reading and math, some just math, some just reading, and then there was a control group. Simply put, the results were extremely good. We were very pleased. But at the end of 2 years, IBM wanted to go commercial on the system, and we did not want to have any part in that aspect of things. So we sort of went our separate ways. A couple of my PhDs joined the IBM Corporation and went with the development of this was called the IBM 1500 system. And they sold about 60 of them over the years, many of them to the military for instruction. They had our reading programs available and so forth. In any event, that was the IBM effort. But all through the period while that was taking place, oh, here's a picture. Huh. That's from the Life magazine story too. I'd long forgotten that picture of the two of us in Life magazine. But all of the time that we were working with the IBM system, we kept the PDP-1 system going, but we kept expanding it because we needed a lot of computer power to individualize the instruction the way we wanted to. And once we broke off from IBM, we still maintain good relations with IBM, but once we broke off from IBM, we expanded the PDP-1 system, and you can see there were all sorts of, this is before the days of personal computers and all. You can see there are all sorts of PDP 10s, 8s, and so forth, but there's the PDP-1 up there. And we were running basically through phone lines, terminals out in Washington, D.C., Seattle, San Francisco, the school districts in Mississippi, Kentucky. We were running as many as 3,000 students a day on the system at remote sites and using the curriculum that had been modified for that was first developed for the IBM system. But it was much simpler, and here is, I have this slide because I have a movie on my website of the system that we were then working on, and you can see it's much simpler, the displays are simpler, but it worked really quite well. And like most people in those days at Stanford, after a few years we started a company called Computer Curriculum Corporation, based on the work done at Stanford, and that was what was expected. Fred Terman, of course, was much behind all of this, and Fred had one of his lunches, and we needed startup money. Okay, now I'm in trouble. And he invited Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Packard, and they each put up $500,000, and that was our startup money. So there you go. Next thing, and I will do this is, but that was, the computer work was not my main interest. My main interest was the theory of memory and cognition, when I first came back to Stanford, I began to publish some papers outlining a more general theory of memory and cognition and stimulus sampling theory. And in 1968, with one of my students, I published a paper, Human Memory, a Proposed System and Its Control Processes. And it was remarkably well received. Here, a few years later, there's a story, a paper in the Scientific American. A few years later, all the papers related to the theory are translated into Russian. I just happen to have, that's one of the few things I have still. 30 years later, a book, symposium on the development of the theory, and what in a sense encouraged me to do this talk today was that 50 years later, they were a year late for the anniversary, the 50-year anniversary, but there was an entire issue of the Journal of Memory and Cognition devoted to the theory, some 19 papers, and then a summary paper at the beginning, and the abstract is what again, this is on my website, but in this article we review the framework proposed in the 1968 by Atkinson and Schifrin. We discuss the prior context that led to its production, including the advent of cognitive and mathematical modeling, its principal concepts, the sequence, I can't read it, you can read it. But in any event, it's been a theory that's, that paper, the 1968 paper, is one of the most frequently cited papers in the history of the psychological and cognitive sciences. And here it is 50 years later, stronger than ever, and really quite pleasant. What's the next slide? This, at a place like Stanford, writing a textbook doesn't get you any merits. But one of the senior faculty at Stanford, a very distinguished psychologist named Hilgard, had published an introductory psychology text He had heard about my teaching at UCLA. I'd not used his book. He invited me to join him as a co-author in the 4th edition. So in the 4th edition, 1967, we came out with a Introduction to Psychology, 4th edition, and it became a barn burner. A few years later, we came out with the 5th edition, and then it became Hildegard Atkinson and Rita Atkinson, because Rita had played a key role in everything. And a few editions later, it became, in the 8th edition, it became, the author ordership was Rita Atkinson, Richard Atkinson, and Ernest Hildegard. And the publisher was very worried about having a woman as the first author. Remember, this is a long time ago. So it would not cut into the sales of the book. Well, it worked out quite well. We did 10 editions, from the 4th to the 14th edition, some 36 years. It was the largest selling textbook at the time in college publishing. I didn't even say psychology. I said in all of college publishing. The only competitor it had was Samuelson's book, Introduction to Economics. Some of you must have taken introductory psychology using that textbook, but maybe not. In any event, preparing for this talk, I hadn't thought about it in a long time, but we realized that now it's called the Atkinson and Hildegard's Introduction to Psychology, and there I found a picture, I'd never seen it before, of the 15th edition. And on the internet, they announced that the 17th edition comes out in December of 2009, and the title is Atkinson and Hildegard's Introduction to Psychology. So that's my years at Stanford. Not quite. But going back to my days in Chicago, one of my roommates was a man named Richard Boone. In fact, we went to the Democratic Convention together that I described earlier, and we were close friends throughout a lifetime. He died a few years ago, but the reason I put up half of this obituary is that he was very close to Jack Kennedy. When Kennedy died, he ran the War on Poverty programs for Johnson, but really was a Bobby Kennedy man after that, and was close to Bobby Kennedy until his death. He ran he was at one time the president of the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation. In any event, in the spring of 1968, he calls me and says, Bobby Kennedy's running for president. We want you to come back, be part of a task force, and your task force will be concerned with educational policy. What should a new president do in terms of educational policy? So it was sort of an order. Rita did not come back with me, but I went back to Washington. I lived in the DuPont Plaza Hotel, if you know the DuPont Circle. It was a wild time. It was, I think it was almost as bad as the current world that we're in. There were curfews, there were riots in Washington. The military was out on the street in jeeps. It was an interesting time. And I spent until June of that year working with a small group of people laying out a plan for Kennedy's educational agenda. Well, that all ended in June of 1968. Kennedy was mortally wounded, and that was it. I went back to Stanford. I, of course, had been on a leave of absence for Stanford. Oh, God.
No, you're fine, you're good. It's 45 minutes.
Boy, this is
Or
bad.
45 minutes is.
Yeah, but in any event, by this point in time, I had a rather perfect life. I really enjoyed life at Stanford. Rita was happy. We had a house right next door to the president's house. It was a perfect world. And then in 1975, I got a call from the chairman of the National Board of the National Science Foundation. Here's the internet description of the National Science Foundation. Simply put, he said that a number of people had suggested that the job of deputy director was open. There were 2 presidential appointments, one for the director of NSF and the other for the deputy director of NSF. The deputy director's job was open, and would I be interested in coming there? Be a leave of absence, but anywhere from 2 to 6 years, would I be interested in coming? Well, who put that idea in the head of the National Science Board? It was Fred Turman. NSF had some pretty serious problems at the time, and Fred said, Dick's the guy that should help you guys. And so I thought about it and thought it was a good idea, but I decided to call my friend Dick Boone. What did he think of it? By the way, Ford is president at this point. Nelson Rockefeller is the vice president. It's a year and a half to the election, the 1976 election. And I called Boone and said, I'm thinking about becoming deputy director of NSF, and he was rather curt. I remember the phone call well. He said, I'll get back to you. Well, about an hour later, Senator Kennedy calls me, and he says, Dick, we need you back here. We want you back here. If you become director of NSF, I'll give you all the support I can. And by the way, Dick, I'm the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, to which NSF reports. Well, I'm going to skip a lot of stuff here, but at that point, I decided to go back to Washington, and I'm sworn in as deputy director. Confirmation surprised the White House, because like today, nothing was moving at that late in the administration, and suddenly I went through the process very quickly. So when I got there were some real problems, and I'll just give you a flavor for them. We had a science education program. We'd started that with Sputnik. It's over?
Click.
Oh. No, I'm not ready to click yet. Am I?
Fine.
We had a science education project that we started in response to Sputnik. We were falling behind in theory and science education programs. Everything went pretty well. Probably some of you had the new math. Remember the term new math? That was the first of the NSF projects. And physics and chemistry went very well, but then we hit biology, and that went well until there were discussions in the high school courses of evolution, and that, remember this is a while ago, that really kicked off a lot of protests around the country. This should not be taught in the high schools. There was another example. There were films showing cultural diversity, and there was a film of an Eskimo tribe, and when the elder members of the family got too old to support themselves, they were gently put on an ice float and sent out to sea. That disturbed a lot of people, and there was also in the film an account of an Eskimo, if he had to travel long distances across the ice, and his wife wasn't warm enough, it wasn't well enough to go with him, he'd contract to have some other wife go with him. These things bothered a lot of people. And Foxmeyer at the time was giving Golden Fleece Awards in large numbers, and this for projects that were wasting government activities. And I must say, every time he gave one, I thought it was a good one, and the agency that got it deserved it, except for the ones that NSF got. He had great fun with NSF. Over time, Foxmeyer and I became fairly friendly. Once I became director of the NSF, he never gave the NSF a single golden fleece. But as soon as I stepped down as director, he started giving it. Basically, he said it was just too good publicity. So there were problems in NSF, and I was aware of them. But shortly thereafter, the GAO came out with a report. The Government Accounting Office came out with a report, and it had been asked for by the Congress. It was an audit of the science education programs at NSF. And basically, the report said that they were good programs from a student's perspective, but that the contracting, the use of peer review had been abused, basically that the foundation had done a bad job managing its business in this area, and further, that we had, in reporting to the Congress, misrepresented the facts. It was a brutal report. At that point, the science advisor, at that point, the director, a remarkable individual. Denver, are you here?
Yes.
This is, I can't tell you about Stever, but this is Stever. No, just sit down.
I thought you wanted me to come up there.
So, in any event, Guy Stever, a remarkable person, is the director of NSF, and Nixon had fired his science advisor, didn't like the advice that he was getting. When Ford and Rockefeller come on board, one of the first things they want to do is establish the science advisor's office again, and they do it through congressional legislation, and Guy Stever then becomes a science advisor. I'm in Russia at the time. He calls me. I'll finish in 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yes, it's fine with me. This is your first.
I'm in Russia at the time. He calls me and he said, "Dick, Monday morning, you'll be the acting director of NSF." So for the next year, I'm the acting director of NSF, and that's this. And then later, I'm appointed as director of NSF. Well, we had the problem, we had the GAO report, and suddenly I was running the National Science Foundation. I didn't really understand all the details of how the government ran, and I thought I had certain authorities. And the National Science Board, 24 individuals, distinguished scientists, distinguished individuals, very knowledgeable people, were very much on my side on just about everything. And so I reorganized the foundation. That's a big deal, reorganizing an operation of that sort. I had a reduction in force. It was called a RIF, and OMB told me, you can't RIF, you can't do that. I terminated a couple of programs. I'm not going to tell you the names of them because you think it was a bad choice, but we terminated some programs and we reorganized the foundation. And because the board was solidly behind it, it was a mix of Democrats and Republicans appointed by Democrat and Republican presidents. And because Kennedy was not going to give us any trouble, the reorganization of NSF works out quite beautifully. And when Carter is elected president, one of the members of the National Science Board becomes his science advisor. I'm appointed deputy director. I'm appointed director of the National Science Foundation, and he and I are the first two people confirmed in the new administration, and the reason for that is that Ted Kennedy made things happen. The rest of the talk is about what happens when I'm director. One of the things that's always been key to my world has been technology transfer. When we started that company in Stanford CCC company, the whole issue of intellectual property was involved in moving research into application was a big factor, and we had problems. The country had problems, and one of our key issues was technology transfer. I'm not going to talk about engineering. I'm a great fan of engineering, and that's another story. Because engineering has become so important in the realm of science that it needs to be put on almost an equal footing with the other sciences. And then there's a story about a paper in my collection of papers. By the way, here's a paper. If you want it, there are about 20 copies up there. It's called The Golden Fleece: Science Education and U.S. Science Policy, and it describes a lot of my experiences at NSF and what we were doing at NSF through both the period as deputy, acting, and director. Here is my website, and on my website is under speeches and articles is a reference to this talk and a group of articles that you can just punch at. And chapter 2, Education of the Chancellor, that comes out of the history of my presidency. The alumni medal is my accounts of life at the University of Chicago. The forward to Fred I wrote the forward to Fred Terman's biography, the one that I showed you up there before. Here is a review, my forward to that. The next one is a very brief but complete description of efforts in computer-assisted instruction that we had at Stanford. Then the next is the article, the lead article in the journal that was a 50-year memorial journal, special issue. And then the Golden Fleece, it's there, and you can get it there. The Connect Founders is sort of a history of my involvement in technology transfer. And when I came to UCSD and when I became president, that became very key issues for me in terms of getting the research out of the university into the marketplace. And then the last one, which I think will be one that some people will be quite interested in, is that NSF became, as I was director, the lead agency in negotiating an exchange of students and scholars between China and the United States. And I signed literally the first agreement in history, that is formal agreement in history, signed by both the government of China and the People's Republic of China and the United States, and that's in that article. So that's my memoir. What's the time?
That's it, we're out of time.
Oh, yeah.